Hey everyone, tonight we're heading deep into the frozen forests of early America, before there even was an America. Imagine yourself on horseback, sleet stabbing at your cheeks, mud clinging to your boots, and wolves howling just out of sight. Now imagine you're only 21 years old, and someone handed you a map, pointed to a blank spot labeled French Fort, and said, "Go tell them to leave." Yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, drop your city and what time it is in the comments. I want to know who else is up too late with a blanket and a snack. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get going tonight. It started with a letter and a job no one else really wanted. I was just barely old enough to grow a full beard, though don't ask Martha what she thought of it later, and I was already a major in the Virginia militia. That sounds fancy, but truth be told, it mostly meant I was good at taking orders, good with horses, and willing to freeze my limbs off in the backwoods if someone paid me a little silver. Governor Dinwiddie, whose name still sounds like a sneeze, called me into his office and handed me a sealed letter for the French. He said, "Deliver this to Fort LeBoeuf. Tell them the Ohio Territory belongs to the British Crown." I stared at him. "How far is that?" He shrugged. "A few hundred miles, through wilderness. No roads, in December, sure. What could possibly go wrong?" I assembled a small team, my trusty guide, Christopher Gist, a rugged, reliable man with a beard that looked like it could trap birds, a few woodsmen, a translator who spoke French better than me, which wasn't hard, and some native allies who knew the trails better than any map. We packed light, mostly dried meat, powder, some blankets, and lots of hope. The first night on the trail, frost bit into my boots so hard my toes went numb. I tried to warm them by the fire, but that just made them sting. I remember the smell of pine smoke and wet leather, and the sound of Gist snoring like a dying bear. I lay awake, staring at the stars, thinking, this is it. This is the beginning of something. I just didn't know what yet. By the third day, we were pushing through swampy bogs, half-frozen streams, and dense thickets that clawed at our coats. My horse slipped twice. Once, I thought we'd lose him to the mud. Once, I thought we'd lose me. There was something eerie about the land back then, untamed. Beautiful, yes, but like a wild animal. It didn't care if you lived or died. At night, we heard distant drums, maybe tribal ceremonies, maybe warnings. Gist said we should sleep with our rifles close. I slept with mine under my arm like a teddy bear, though instead of fluff, it reeked of sulfur and old grease. By the end of the first week, we were halfway there. Cold, soaked, tired, and that's when we met Tanaka Risen, the half-king. Now this man was a whole character. A native Seneca leader with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. He didn't like the French much, claimed they were manipulating tribes and stealing land. So he agreed to guide us the rest of the way. He also shared roasted bear meat, which was shockingly good, and a drink that tasted like fermented tree bark. I smiled and nodded through the bitterness, trying not to gag. One night, he told me that the French wouldn't leave peacefully. I asked why. He just looked into the fire and said, "They think your words are as light as ash." That stuck with me. The next few days we crossed icy rivers, climbed ridges slick with sleet, and nearly lost our translator when his horse spooked at a fox and bolted into a ditch. The man survived, but let's just say he smelled like frozen pond for days. When we finally reached Fort LeBoeuf, it looked like a damp log palace surrounded by soldiers in tattered blue coats. They eyed us like we were delivering a court summons. Which we kind of were. The French commander, Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, was polite, even charming. He invited us in, gave us wine that tasted suspiciously like vinegar, and read the letter with a frown that deepened every minute. Sighed, and I paraphrase here, "Thank you for your message. We're not leaving. have some venison. Diplomacy at its finest. He did give me a formal response letter, which I tucked into my coat like it was the Holy Grail. Job done, right? Well, if only it were that easy. Historians still debate whether. I understood at that moment that we were walking toward a war. Some say I was just a naive young officer following orders. Others think I sensed the spark that would eventually ignite the whole continent. What I can tell you is that as we left Fort Le Boeuf, snow started falling in big, wet clumps. The trail back looked longer and colder and darker, but I had no idea the worst part of the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. We didn't even make it a full day out of Fort Le Boeuf before everything started to go sideways. The snow, which had started out picturesque, think snow globe, but with more frostbite, turned into an icy slush that soaked through my boots, breeches, gloves, and what remained of my dignity. Christopher Gist, ever the optimist, muttered, "Well, at least it's not raining." That night it rained. Our route back took us through the wildest parts of what's now western Pennsylvania. But back then, it was just trees. Trees and bogs and rivers and the occasional very angry squirrel. And yes, before you ask, there was a point where we ate squirrel. Tastes like desperation and pine needles. Now here's the thing about trails in winter, they vanish. A path you used 2 weeks ago? Buried under snow, flooded out, or trampled by buffalo. So we relied on landmarks and instinct. Which sounds romantic until you realize landmarks meant vaguely familiar rock, and instinct meant, I hope Gist isn't lost too. Somewhere near the Venango Trail, we started noticing we weren't alone. Shadowy figures in the distance. Fresh tracks in the snow. Once, we found a set of footprints circling our camp. Just one set. Didn't belong to any of us. So now we weren't just wet and cold, we were being watched. To lighten the mood, I tried a joke. I said, if anyone kills me out here, I hope it's fast and not embarrassing, like slipping on frozen horse poop. Gist didn't laugh. Probably because that had already happened to him once that day. One evening, as we were crossing a partially frozen stream, my horse fell through the ice. I barely managed to leap off before we both went under. I landed hard on the bank, soaking my coat and smashing my knee. We hauled the poor animal out shivering, bleeding, terrified. It limped the rest of the way, and then came the incident. We were still deep in French-controlled territory, trying to make it back to the Allegheny River. That's when we met a man who claimed he was a friendly native scout. He offered to guide us through a shortcut. He smiled too much, asked too many questions, carried a musket that looked a little too clean. Tanaka Risen had already gone ahead, so it was just me, Gist, and this suspicious guide. That night, the guide offered to hunt for our supper. Said he'd bring back fresh meat. He brought back nothing. Then the next morning, while we were trudging through a narrow pass, he spun around, raised his musket, and fired. At me. Missed. Barely. Gist, bless him, didn't miss. He tackled the man before he could reload and discouraged him with the butt of his rifle until he promised not to try that again. We let him go, though. Maybe not the smartest decision, but we didn't. Want to start a blood feud? Historians still debate whether that was a political move or just youthful stupidity. Honestly, bit of both. After that, Gist and I ditched the horses and decided to cut cross-country on foot. Through 100 miles of frozen forest. We built crude rafts to cross the Allegheny River. Mine promptly capsized. I ended up clinging to a floating log while ice chunks banged into my legs like nature's version of dodgeball. Gist somehow didn't laugh. Probably too cold. We made it to an island in the middle of the river and nearly froze to death waiting for the current to slow down. That night, I wrapped myself in a wet blanket, laid on a patch of ice, and stared up at the moon thinking, so this is how it ends. Not in battle, not with a sword in hand. Just slowly freezing like a sad popsicle. In the morning, the river had frozen enough to walk across. Barely. Gist went first. Cracks echoed under his boots. I followed, trying not to think about my weight, or the fact that I still hadn't told my mother where I'd gone. By the time we made it back to the colonial settlements, I looked like a ghost wrapped in deer skins. People barely recognized me. Someone actually asked if I'd been mauled by a bear. I told them no, just life. I didn't go straight home. First, I rode to Williamsburg to deliver the French response to Governor Dinwiddie. I handed over the letter. Then my journal, the one I'd been scribbling in during the trip. The governor skimmed it, nodded, and said something like, "This will make for a fine report." Fine report? Trying near-death saga. I should have charged admission. To my surprise, Dinwiddie had the journal printed and distributed to the colonial press. I was suddenly famous. People said I was brave, heroic, noble. One guy even called me the young lion of Virginia. I didn't feel like a lion. I felt like a man who hadn't had dry socks in 6 weeks. Still, I'll admit seeing my name in print was something. I'd gone into the woods as a kid with a letter. I came out a man with a reputation. Of course, I had no idea that my little wilderness misadventure would become the opening act to a global war, but we'll get there. By the time the frost finally left my boots and the mud dried off my coat, I was back home pretending I knew what to do with fame. Spoiler alert, I didn't. The journal Dinwiddie published, yeah, the one I scribbled by firelight while half frozen, it made me into something I wasn't quite ready to be. To the average colonist, I was now Major Washington, defender of the Ohio, which sounds a lot cooler than that guy who nearly froze to death on a log. Invitations started coming in. People wanted to shake my hand, ask about the wilderness, the French, what bear meat tasted like, but mostly they asked, "Will there be war?" I usually shrugged and said something vague like, "It's complicated." Because it was. The French hadn't budged an inch. Their answer to our diplomatic mission was a politely written no, backed up by 2,000 armed men and a brand new string of forts cutting across the frontier like a raised eyebrow. And me? I got promoted to lieutenant colonel. Because apparently, survived snow and sabotage was good enough on the resume. So naturally, when a new mission cropped up to build a fort at the strategic junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, I said yes. Because clearly I hadn't learned my lesson about freezing to death yet. We set out with about 160 men, mostly raw recruits with names like Ned and Billy, and a love of tobacco but not of obeying orders. The trail was rough, and the weather was, once again in full drama mode: fog, sleet, rain, then sudden sun like the forest was playing a practical joke. On the way, we heard rumors. A French patrol was nearby, spying, lurking. One local told us they were just over the hill, camping under a grove of sugar maples. So we did the logical thing. We prepared to surprise them. Now, before we go further, let me clarify something. Historians still debate whether I was ordered to attack or just told to defend British interests. Let's just say those interests got very defended. That day. It was early morning, damp, gray light. We crept through the woods with Tanaka risen, the half-king leading the way again. He was eager, angry, said the French had insulted him personally. We found the French encampment just as dawn broke. They were still half asleep, curled up around their packs like squirrels around acorns. We opened fire. The fight was quick, loud, messy. A musket cracked beside my ear and left it ringing for a full week. Mud flew up in chunks. Smoke coiled through the trees. And then it was over. 13 Frenchmen dead. One ensign, Joseph Cowland de Jumonville, lay among them, gasping and bleeding into the moss. We took 21 prisoners. Tanaka risen approached Jumonville, who was wounded but alive. What happened next still haunts me. Tanaka risen looked down, muttered something in his own language, and then struck the Frenchman with a tomahawk, just like that. I stood there in shock. Was this war? Was this diplomacy? Was I supposed to stop him? Applaud? Scream? We buried the dead. I kept my face calm. Inside, my stomach turned. That wasn't what I thought war was supposed to be. I thought it would be organized. Neat. The news of the ambush spread faster than a tavern brawl. We tried to say it was self-defense, that the French had been scouting us with bad intentions. But the French didn't see it that way. They called it an assassination of a diplomat. And me? Well, I suddenly wasn't that promising young officer from Virginia anymore. I was the guy who started the war. Let that sink in. 22 years old. First real skirmish. And now every man with a wig in Europe was saying I kicked off a global conflict. The thing is, they weren't entirely wrong. Jumonville's death, bloody, fast, undiplomatic, would ignite a powder keg. France would soon declare war on Britain. Troops would flood into North America, all because I couldn't keep my boots dry. Or my allies calm. Odd fact here, Jumonville's older brother would later lead a full-blown French attack against me at a place called Fort Necessity. Yeah, that's coming up. Sibling vengeance at its finest. But in that moment, as we marched our prisoners back through the forest, I just remember feeling cold. Not the usual wet socks cold, but the kind that settles in your bones when you realize you've just changed the course of history, and not necessarily for the better. We hadn't even built our fort yet. We were still digging ditches in the mud, and the French were already coming with reinforcements. I didn't sleep that night, just did. Probably dreamed of roasted bear again. I just lay there, staring up at the sky, wondering what came next, and dreading it. The rain came down like it had a personal grudge against us. We were knee-deep in the muck outside our hastily built outpost, what I had decided, with more hope than reason, to call Fort Necessity. Because you know, when you're soaked, undersupplied, and outnumbered, the one thing you really need is irony. We picked a clearing in the Great Meadows to build it. Nice spot, open field, good visibility, a nearby stream. Too bad it was also surrounded by forested high ground. That little detail will come back to haunt me. Now, don't picture a grand stone fortress with battlements and banners. Fort Necessity was basically a circular palisade made of sharpened logs and wishful thinking. We dug trenches around it, filled sandbags, and tried to make ourselves look like we knew what we were doing. Spoiler, we did not know what we were doing. My men, brave though they were, had never built a fort, or fought in a siege, or really followed instructions. Some of them were teenagers. One guy showed up with no shoes and just a hatchet, which he said used to belong to a bear. I didn't ask. Then came word that the French were coming. Not just a small patrol this time, hundreds of them, with regular troops, native allies, artillery, and a very angry commander by the name of Louis Coulon de Villers, Jumonville's older brother. Yeah, that was awkward. Historians still debate whether Villers was coming for strategic reasons or just good old-fashioned revenge. Either way, we braced for impact. On July 3, 1754, they arrived. Rain still falling. The French spread out through the woods surrounding our sad little fort. We couldn't even see them, just flashes of musket fire and the occasional cheer. When they hit something, our trenches flooded instantly. One soldier slipped and cracked his skull. Another accidentally fired his musket while cleaning it and shot himself in the foot. And I was standing in the middle of this muddy bowl, watching it all go sideways. We returned fire, of course, but it was like spitting at a hurricane. My men were soaked, hungry, jittery. Gunpowder turned clumpy. Muskets misfired, odd fact. We tried to use tarps to keep the powder dry. One blew away and landed on a cow. The cow didn't appreciate it. At one point, I looked down and realized the water in the trenches was up to my calves. My boots squelched every time I moved. I considered taking them off and just going full swamp creature. By mid-afternoon, we were trapped. Some of the wounded groaned in the corners of the fort. Others prayed. And me, I paced. I calculated. I rehearsed what I might have to say if we surrendered. I practiced my "yes, this is fine" face. Then, a white flag appeared from the trees. The French offered terms. And yes, here comes the real fun part. The document was written in French. I could barely manage polite conversation in French, let alone legal negotiation. So I relied on our translator, a Dutchman named Van Brom, who spoke French like someone who had once seen a French dictionary from across the room. We agreed to the terms. We signed the document. The shooting stopped. My men sighed in relief. Only later did I find out what I had signed. According to the translation, we had admitted to assassinating Jumonville. Assassinating, like we were secret agents in a bad novel. I nearly spat out my tea when I heard. Historians still debate whether Van Brom mistranslated on purpose or just didn't know the word. I tend to think he was doing his best. Badly, the fallout was immediate. The French waved our signed confession around like a trophy. And suddenly, I wasn't just the guy who started the war, I was also the guy who confessed to murder. Great. We marched away from Fort Necessity, the next day, our tails between our legs, the rain finally letting up as if to mock us. My men looked broken. I felt worse. But you know the weird part? I still believed. Not in the fort, not in our chances, but in something bigger. I believed that this messy, chaotic, painful frontier fight was going to change the world, even if I had just made a complete mess of the opening act. You'd think after surrendering a soggy wooden donut of a fort and accidentally confessing to diplomatic murder, I'd go into hiding, maybe take up farming full-time, open a tavern, something with less risk of international incidents. But no. I went back to Williamsburg, and I was received like a returning hero. I remember riding through the town's dusty streets, still caked in mud, and people actually cheered. Someone handed me a cider. A little girl pointed at me and said, "That's the one who fought the French." I wanted to correct her. No, I tried to fight the French, and then I signed a document in a language I barely understand. But I just smiled. The colonial government saw me as brave, determined, a young man who had shown grit under impossible circumstances. And sure, Fort Necessity was a disaster. But people don't remember the mud and misfires. They remember that I stood my ground, that I tried, and that was enough. Sort of. Here's the twist. Despite the fanfare, I wasn't allowed to stay in the British military. Why? Because I was colonial-born. Yep. British officers outranked me simply by virtue of their birth. Even the ones with less experience, fewer muscles, and way worse hair. So they gave me a backhanded compliment. "Well done, young Washington. Now step aside for someone born in Surrey." It stung. I had put my life on the line twice now for king and country. And yet I was still a second-class officer in my own land. Historians still debate whether this was the moment I started to resent British authority. If the seed of revolution was planted not on a battlefield, but in the heart of a young man told, "You're good, but not that good." But hey, if I couldn't serve under the redcoat flag, I could still protect my home. Virginia, now fully alert to the threat of French expansion, decided to take matters into its own hands. Governor Dinwiddie commissioned a new regiment of 1,000 men and offered me command. Full colonel. My own troops. My own rules. So, of course, I said yes. The trouble? These weren't trained soldiers. These were farmers, drunks, runaways, and the occasional ambitious teenager who thought war sounded fun. One recruit brought a duck to training and insisted it was his tactical advantage. We named it Colonel Quackers. My job was to turn this ragtag mess into an army. We drilled in open fields. We built breastworks. We practiced loading, aiming, and firing in unison. And I yelled a lot. Not because I liked it, but because if you don't yell at a man trying to clean his musket while it's still loaded, someone's going to lose a toe. I tried to lead by example. I slept in the same cold tents, ate the same wormy biscuits. endured the same mosquito ambushes. One night, I woke up with a raccoon in my bedroll. He wasn't pleased. Neither was I, but slowly, the men began to respect me. Not for my title, but for sticking it out with them. For bleeding with them. For never asking them to do something. I wouldn't, and we needed to be ready, because the French were reinforcing their claim on the Ohio Valley, building up Fort Duquesne, a massive stronghold at the confluence of the rivers. And we were planning a full-on offensive. Now, because this was a British war, that meant they were going to send a real general to lead it. Enter General Edward Braddock, a towering man, British to the bone, full of confidence, contempt for colonials, and an unwavering belief in proper European warfare. He brought with him 2 regiments of redcoats, shimmering brass buttons drums, horses, and all the discipline you'd expect from men who'd fought in Europe's finest campaigns. And then he met me. To his credit, Braddock didn't laugh in my face. He just didn't take me seriously. I was the colonial, a kind of curious mascot who might be helpful as a guide, but definitely not as a commander. Still, I offered to join the campaign as a volunteer. No rank, no pay. Just along for the ride, because I wanted to see how professionals did it. And also because I had a bad feeling. We began marching toward Fort Duquesne in the spring of 1755. Hundreds of troops, artillery wagons, horses, officers in full dress uniform. It looked impressive. Too impressive. We moved slowly, painfully. So, Braddock insisted on leveling every road, building every bridge, clearing every obstacle. We were practically laying down cobblestones for the French to follow back to their own fort. The wilderness hated us. Trees refused to yield, swamps gurgled ominously, mosquitoes multiplied. I started to suspect the duck might actually be a tactical advantage. I kept warning Braddock, "Sir, this is not Europe. The French won't line up and fight fair. They'll shoot from behind trees, from the shadows." He waved me off. Savages and bushfighters are no match for trained British regulars. Historians still debate whether Braddock was too proud to listen or just too blind to change. Either way, he would learn the hard way. And soon. It was July 9, 1755, hot, sticky, the kind of air that clings to your skin and makes every movement feel like you're pushing through syrup. We were about 10 miles from Fort Duquesne, near the Monongahela River. Braddock had split the army into 2 columns. The advance group, with Braddock at the head, included around 1,300 men. I rode along, still a volunteer, technically Rankles's, but he trusted me sort of as a guide and observer. We were marching in perfect European formation, drums beating, flags waving, redcoats gleaming in the sun. It looked spectacular. For a parade. Too bad we weren't in London. We crossed the Monongahela twice, our boots churning the muddy riverbed, our supplies strung out in a long, vulnerable line. I kept scanning the woods. The silence was off. You know how you get that itch behind your eyes, like something's watching you? That was me all morning. Then it happened. Without warning, muskets cracked from the trees. At first, it sounded like someone dropping a box of firecrackers down a hill. Then the screaming started. The French and their native allies had ambushed us. They'd waited until our entire column was stretched out, vulnerable, boxed in by thick woods on either side. And then they hit us like ghosts with rifles. It was chaos. Redcoats fired blindly into the trees, unable to see their attackers. The dense formation Braddock insisted on became a death trap. Soldiers were packed so tightly that when one fell, 2 more tripped over him. I saw a man spin in place, reload, and accidentally bayonet his own boot. I was nearly thrown from my horse twice, ducking branches, trying to yell orders no one could hear. Gunpowder smoke filled the air, thick as fog. The ground was slick with mud and blood. And still, the shots kept coming from the woods. Here's your odd fact. One French allied Native warrior reportedly climbed a tree and rained down arrows and musket shots from above, like a sniper squirrel. A terrifying, musket-toting sniper. Squirrel, Braddock, he didn't retreat. He didn't adapt. He stood there shouting orders like he was still on some European plane. Form ranks. Maintain your lines. I admired the bravery, but the man was fighting the wrong war. And then I saw him fall. Braddock took a bullet through the chest. He collapsed like someone yanked the strings out of him. Officers rushed to him, but by then, the army was in full panic. Horses screamed. Wagons overturned. Men dropped their weapons and ran. I knew if someone didn't step up, we'd lose everyone. So I did. Still technically a volunteer, I took control. I rode through the chaos, rallying as many men as I could. My horse was shot out from under me. I grabbed another. That one got hit too. In total, 4 horses were shot out from under me that day. And somehow, I wasn't touched. Not a scratch. Not a tear in my coat. Not a dent in my ridiculous colonial pride. Historians still debate whether I was simply lucky or whether something more divine had its hand on my shoulder. Later, native warriors who fought in that battle would claim they'd aimed directly at me and missed every time. That I was protected. Me? I don't know. But it rattled me. We finally managed to organize a retreat. I led the remnants back across the Monongahela, bloodied and broken, but alive. Braddock, still barely breathing, was carried on a makeshift litter. He died a few days later. We buried him in the road and marched over the grave to hide it from the French. No tombstone, no ceremony. Just footsteps and dirt. The defeat was complete. Over 900 men were killed or wounded. It was one of the worst disasters in British colonial history, and yet, for me, something changed. Suddenly, people noticed the young Virginian who'd ridden through bullets, who hadn't flinched, who had taken command when others froze. Word spread, especially the part about my miraculous survival. I was no longer the guy who surrendered Fort Necessity. I was the hero of Monongahela. Weird title, considering we got stomped. Back in Williamsburg, I was welcomed again. But this time with a little more respect. A little more deference. Even British generals started to take notice. That Washington boy, they'd say, seems to have some sense after all. But I wasn't celebrating. I couldn't stop seeing the faces of the dead. The men who'd marched into a trap because of arrogance. The friends I couldn't save. And deep down, a question began to form. Why do we keep following orders from men who don't understand this land? Why are we born here, raised here, always treated as lesser by the empire we bleed for? It wouldn't be the last time I asked that question. After Monongahela, I swore off military service. No, seriously. I actually quit. Handed in my metaphorical sword, dusted off my breeches, and went back to Mount Vernon with every intention of never setting foot on a battlefield again. I wanted to farm, drink tea, maybe grow some turnips. Anything that didn't involve muskets or watching my friends fall in the mud. You'd think I'd earned the break, but the war didn't care about my feelings. The French and Indian War was escalating, spreading like fire across the colonies. Skirmishes turned into campaigns. Campaigns turned into full-scale battles. And Virginia? Still sitting right in the blast zone. So in 1755, despite my noble retreat into civilian life, the governor came knocking again. This time, offering me the top spot in the Virginia regiment. Full command, real authority, fancy uniform. Still no British commission. Of course they weren't that generous. I said yes, because I realized something. If the colonies were going to survive, we needed leaders who understood our land, our people, our reality. And if I didn't step up, someone far worse probably would. So began my second act. Now, commanding a frontier army in the 1750s wasn't like directing a play. It was more like trying to choreograph a dance where all the dancers are barefoot farmers with rifles. And the stage is on fire. We were spread thin, defending settlements from raids, escorting supply trains, fortifying forts, and trying not to die of smallpox or boredom. And we built so many forts: Fort Ashby, Fort Loudon, Fort Littleton. I was basically running a DIY Home Depot for colonial defense. Odd fact, I once drew an entire blueprint for a fort using charcoal on the back of a deer hide. Our engineer said it was impressively legible considering it smelled like venison. Our biggest challenge wasn't the French. It was distance. See, most people imagine military service as a string of battles, heroic charges, and stirring speeches. But out here, it was logistics. Food, shoes, nails, powder, salt. Without these, no army could function. At one point, our men were marching with no uniforms. We looked more like disheveled campers than soldiers. One recruit showed up wearing a woman's bonnet because it kept the bugs out. I let it slide. The bugs were horrific, and then there were the politics. The colonial government wanted results, but refused to fund anything properly. The British generals wanted control, but treated us like children with wooden swords. Meanwhile, settlers wanted protection, but also refused to follow orders. Historians still debate whether colonial autonomy was the strength or the downfall of early American military efforts. I'll tell you what it was. Frustrating, but we kept going. In 1758, the British launched another major campaign to take Fort Duquesne, the same fort that had haunted me since Jumonville, since Fort Necessity, since Monongahela. This time, they were serious. General John Forbes led the operation, and I was invited to join, with actual influence, finally, and a seat at the table. Forbes was no Braddock. He understood that the terrain required a different approach. He built a new road, Forbes Road, straight across the backcountry, cutting through the mountains with brutal efficiency. We moved slowly, methodically, built supply depots, fortified our path, trained our troops for guerrilla tactics, not just line formations. But tension still flared. One British officer accused my men of stealing rum rations. My men accused his of being useless as boiled feathers. I had to break up a fistfight using a fencing foil and a bucket of water. Oh, and we kept getting ambushed. The French weren't dumb. They knew we were coming. Then came the bloodiest mess of that campaign, the Battle of Fort Ligonier. It wasn't a large-scale clash, but it was personal. I was ordered to lead a reconnaissance force. We engaged what we thought was a small enemy patrol. Turned out, it was a trap. Bullets flew. Trees splintered. I shouted until my throat bled. And somewhere in the madness, our own men mistook another colonial unit for the French. Friendly fire. Again, we pulled back, stunned and shaken. But even in that chaos, I saw something change. The men didn't panic. They regrouped. They protected each other. They looked to me for direction. That night I sat by the fire, staring into the embers, boots soaked, coat torn, exhausted beyond words. And I felt pride. Not because we won, but because we endured, and that was new. Later that year, we finally reached Fort Duquesne, only to find it abandoned. The French had set it on fire and fled. Apparently, they decided the British were coming in too hot, and they didn't. What another Monongahela. The fort smoldered like a ghost of every mistake I'd made. I stood in the ashes, remembering Jumonville, the rain, the mud, Braddock, and I smiled. We rebuilt it, named it Fort Pitt. You may know the city that later rose around it. Pittsburgh. A victory, sure, but also a closing chapter. Soon after, I resigned from the military again, this time for real. Because a new fire had started in me. Not of war. Of purpose. And something told me this wasn't the last time I'd ride into history. By 1759, I had traded my sword for a plowshare. Again, I returned to Mount Vernon, a veteran twice over, aged far beyond my 20-something years, and ready, desperately ready for quiet. The hills of Virginia seemed to breathe deeper than any battlefield, and for once, I let myself believe I might find peace here. And just as I was settling into the rhythm of land and crops and long afternoons, Martha entered my life. Now look, I wasn't exactly Mr. Romance. I didn't write sonnets or recite poetry under moonlight. But when I met Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children and a sharp wit, something clicked. She was composed, intelligent, and kind in ways that made me really pause for the first time in years. We married in January 1759. The wedding wasn't lavish, despite what people say. It was modest, warm, filled with neighbors and family. The most luxurious thing there was my powdered wig, which I swear doubled as a squirrel trap. And no, we didn't ride off into the sunset. We rode through the mud up the Potomac, with her 2 kids in tow. Mount Vernon became our home, and soon my obsession. I dove headfirst into plantation life. Not just farming managing, I kept meticulous records. I rotated crops. I experimented with new tools and building designs. One year, I tried a new drainage system for our wheat fields that involved digging over a mile of trench by hand. I nearly broke my back and my spirit, but hay wheat yields went up 14%. Not that anyone invited me to a party for it. Odd fact, I once wrote a 14-page letter entirely about manure. It was a heartfelt tribute to compost. Martha found it hilarious. I kept it. But despite the pastoral calm, something tugged at the edges of my days. Politics.c. As a former officer, landowner, and now member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, I was expected to, have opinions. Especially as tensions with Britain continued to rise like sour bread dough in summer. The problem? Britain wanted us to pay for a war we just barely survived. Remember the French and Indian War? Yeah, that debt came back like an uninvited relative with a long memory and short pockets. So Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, requiring that all printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents, carry a paid British stamp. It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the principle. Taxation without representation. Historians still debate whether the colonies could have negotiated a fair compromise with Britain at this point. Whether diplomacy could have worked. But me? I watched the mood shift. Suddenly, taverns buzzed with talk of liberty. Merchants boycotted British goods. Protesters hung effigies of tax collectors in trees like grotesque Christmas ornaments. I didn't throw rocks, but I didn't stop the rock throwers either. I started writing letters again. Not to generals this time, but to fellow Virginians, quietly, carefully, suggesting that we deserved better. That this wasn't what we'd fought for. That maybe, just maybe, we could govern ourselves. Around that time, I stopped wearing as much British lace. Switched from wine to local cider. Not because I hated England, but because I wanted to believe we were enough. It wasn't about rebellion yet. It was about rights. Still, I wasn't out there leading marches with a liberty pole and a tricorn hat stuffed with slogans. I was cautious. Watching, and what I saw? A storm building. There were little things, whispers of soldiers quartered without consent. News of colonists tarred and feathered for refusing to boycott. A shipment of tea dumped in Boston Harbor like soggy leaves. That one, bold, risky, slightly insane, but effective. The British responded with the coercive acts, what we called the intolerable acts. They closed Boston's port, restricted town meetings, and basically reminded us who wore the crown. You could feel the mood changing in the soil itself. That's when I started drilling with the local militia again, quietly. No uniforms. Just practice. Just preparation. Odd as it sounds, I was still hopeful then. Hopeful that Parliament would come to its senses. That maybe the king would intervene. But letters from Boston told another story. Massachusetts was boiling. Militias were organizing. British troops patrolled the streets like foreign invaders. And across the colonies, One word began to rise like smoke from every hearth. Congress. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, bringing together representatives from 12 colonies. I didn't go. I wasn't ready yet. But I read every dispatch like it was scripture. The idea was bold. Unite, petition the king, and if necessary resist. Odd fact, one delegate actually proposed that each colony raise its own navy. In 1774. With what ships? Canoes and fishing boats? We laughed then. Not for long. In 1775, tensions reached a breaking point. British troops marched on Concord. Shots were fired at Lexington. Minutemen stood their ground. Blood was spilled. And just like that, it wasn't theoretical anymore. We were at war. And here's the thing I didn't expect. When the Second Continental Congress met that summer, they didn't just talk strategy or politics. They asked a question: who should lead? And my name was on their lips. Me, the surveyor turned soldier, the manure enthusiast, the man who once signed a surrender in the rain. Historians still debate whether it was my experience, my demeanor, or just the fact that I wore a decent uniform. But in June 1775, the vote was unanimous. They appointed me Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and I quietly, nervously, and with the weight of the future pressing down on me like a mountain, accepted. I kissed Martha goodbye. And rode north, toward Boston, toward war, toward history. Boston smelled like salt and smoke and uncertainty. When I arrived in July of 1775, the city was under siege. British troops had bunkered down, bottled up by thousands of angry New Englanders with pitchforks, muskets, and a whole lot of attitude. From the outside, it looked like we were winning. But from my saddle atop a ridgeline, it was clear this wasn't an army. This was a very loud, very brave mob. So that was my first job as Commander-in-Chief. Turn this spirited mob into a functioning military force. Easier said than done. They called themselves Minutemen, but some couldn't fire a musket without flinching. One group from Rhode Island brought homemade cannonballs. One guy from New Hampshire brought a sword he'd fashioned out of a saw blade. No one had matching coats, some didn't even have shoes. One man, hand to heaven, wore nothing but an apron and a pair of socks. Said he ran out of laundry. I knew what I was in for. Still, we had something the British didn't. Fire in the belly and lice. Lots of lice. Setting up headquarters in Cambridge, I began imposing order. Training schedules, rank structures, supply management, discipline. I spent hours writing letters begging Congress for powder, tents, food, anything. I might have sent more letters in 1775 than I did in my entire life. And most of them were just creative ways of saying, "Send socks, please." Odd fact, I once tried to stretch gunpowder supplies by ordering the recovery of used musket balls from battlefield dirt. Men would literally dig through the soil after skirmishes, rinsing lead and stuffing it back into cartridges. It sort of worked. Sort of. Meanwhile, across the bay, the British weren't exactly sipping tea. After the bloodshed at Bunker Hill, where they technically won, but lost over 1,000 men, they were digging in hard. Fortifications around the city bristled with cannon. Their warships blocked the harbor like sleeping giants. And they underestimated us a lot. So we sat and watched and waited. The siege of Boston was a strange beast. It wasn't constant bloodshed. It was endurance. We kept the British boxed in. They kept trying to wait us out. There were raids, certainly sneaky night skirmishes and spy games. But mostly, it was a months-long staring contest. I tried to boost morale with drills, speeches, even staged reviews of the troops. At one point, I walked the entire length of the lines with my uniform polished and my horse braided like it was prom night. Didn't fix the hunger, but hey, it made the lads feel like someone was in charge. Historians still debate whether I actually believed we could win at this point, or if I was bluffing even to myself. I'll be honest with you, I didn't know. But I knew quitting wasn't an option. I'd been down too many roads to turn back now. Then, salvation came, from a bookseller. Henry Knox, 25 years old. Round-faced, spectacled, and with an enthusiasm for artillery that bordered on obsession. He came to me with a wild idea, to retrieve captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, over 300 miles away, and drag them back through snow, ice, and mountains, using oxen. In the dead of winter. I asked him if he was mad. He said yes. I told him to get started. And somehow he did it. Over 2 months, Knox hauled 60 tons of cannon across frozen rivers and up cliffs slick with ice. Locals still tell stories of Knox's noble train, an oxen convoy so long it stretched through entire towns. One cannon fell into a lake and had to be winched out using ropes, logs, and every curse word known to Massachusetts fishermen. By March 1776, those cannons were in place high atop Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. It was the strategic equivalent of flipping over the chessboard. The British woke up one morning to find that we had artillery pointed at their ships, their barracks, their tea, everything. General Howe blinked. And then he left. On March 17, 1776, British forces evacuated Boston. Over 100 ships, thousands of soldiers, and Tory loyalists all set sail for Nova Scotia. No battle, no final charge, just gone. We had won. Odd fact. Bostonians declared March 17th Evacuation Day, and to this day, it's still a holiday there, coincidentally sharing the date with St. Patrick's Day. 2 reasons to drink, I suppose. As the fleet faded into the horizon, I stood atop Dorchester Heights in silence. The breeze carried the scent of powder and victory, and maybe just a whisper of what lay ahead, because I knew we'd won a siege, not a war. The British were regrouping, and they weren't going to take this embarrassment lightly. Still, for the first time since I'd accepted command, I allowed myself a breath of hope. And then I got back to work, because the next battleground wasn't going to be Boston. It was New York, and it would make everything before look like a warm-up act. New York was chaos. After the British evacuated Boston, they shifted their focus to the strategic heart of the colonies, the bustling, unruly port city of New York. I arrived in the summer of 1776 to find a city bristling with loyalists, British, regulars, and the restless energy of a population divided. My orders were clear: defend the city, keep the British out, and prepare for what I feared would be the largest battle yet. We scrambled to fortify Brooklyn Heights, digging trenches and erecting defenses with anything we could find: barrels, bricks, even barrels full of bricks. The men were tired. Many had never seen a real battle before. Some still had more enthusiasm than skill. One soldier tried to use a frying pan as a shield. I told him to keep it for breakfast. We were vastly outnumbered. British forces under General William Howe arrived, with over 30,000 men, including Hessian mercenary soldiers for hire from Germany, who looked like they came straight from a nightmare with their spiked helmets and deadpan faces. The first clash came on August 27, 1776, in what would be called the Battle of Long Island, or the Battle of Brooklyn, if you prefer. It started as a reconnaissance mission, but quickly turned into a full-scale engagement. The British outflanked our forces by sneaking through Jamaica Pass, a move our scouts had missed. The foggy morning made it nearly impossible to see. The air was thick with gunpowder and the cries of men charging into the unknown. I remember thinking, well, this is not how I imagine New York. We fought hard but were forced into a retreat. The lines broke and confusion spread like wildfire. Friendly fire incidents happened. Men got lost in the woods. One company got stuck crossing a creek and was captured almost without a fight. In the chaos, I barely escaped with my life, retreating across the East River to Manhattan in a small boat under cover of night. I left behind over 1,000 men and what felt like a piece of my soul. Historians still debate whether the defeat was due to poor intelligence, miscommunication, or simply being outnumbered and outmaneuvered. I say all of the above. Odd fact. One of our soldiers lost his wooden leg during the retreat, literally left it behind, and refused to leave without it. Talk about dedication to your prosthetics. Despite the setback, the retreat was a masterstroke of discipline. We evacuated over 9,000 men across treacherous waters without losing a single life to drowning that night. As I looked back at the burning skyline of Brooklyn, I realized the war was going to be long and brutal. We needed a miracle, and the British weren't finished. The next month saw a series of brutal skirmishes and retreats as we tried to hold. New York, supplies ran low. Morale dipped. Desertions rose. Congress debated whether to disband the army or continue the fight. Through it all, I kept reminding the men and myself that we weren't just fighting for a piece of land. We were fighting for a new idea. That idea wasn't yet a country. It was a hope, a dream. And maybe, just maybe, a stubborn refusal to quit. The fall of 1776 was grim. The nights were cold. The men's laughter was rare. But then came a spark. Christmas night, crossing of the Delaware River. A daring plan that would change everything. Christmas Eve, 1776. Picture this. Freezing cold. Snow whipping sideways like it's got a vendetta. And a river that's basically chunks of ice trying to reunite as a solid block. Sounds like a great night for a party? Nope, more like the perfect setting for an insane military gamble. We had just suffered loss after loss. Morale was in the cellar. The enlistments of many men were about to expire, and if they left, the whole revolution might just collapse under the weight of disappointment. We were desperate, and desperation tends to make men crazy in a good way. So here I was, standing on the banks of the Delaware River, weighing the odds. I had about 2,400 men, worn out and ragged, and we were about to attempt the most audacious move of the war, crossing an ice-choked river in the dead of night to surprise a formidable enemy. Camp in Trenton, New Jersey. The plan? Simple enough on paper. Attack the Hessian mercenaries, those German hired guns I mentioned before, who were quartered in Trenton and who thought the war was basically over for the season. They were drunk on Christmas cheer and confidence. We were going to ruin their morning, but the river? That was a nightmare. The icy water bit through our boots. The sleet made the boats slippery death traps, and the wind tried to blow us back to Virginia. Men were seasick, shivering, and some even swore they heard the river talking smack to them. Odd fact. At one point, a few men lost their oars in the river and ended up rowing with tree branches. Not exactly Navy SEAL material. Historians still debate whether this was sheer genius or madness. Honestly, I'm leaning toward a little bit of both. By the time we reached the far shore, many were numb, soaked, and questioning their life choices. But the men's spirits rallied when we moved silently toward Trenton, the snow muffling our steps, our breaths making little clouds in the frozen air. We struck just before dawn on December 26th. The Hessians were caught completely off guard. Their officers were asleep or hungover. Their soldiers scrambled in confusion. We overwhelmed them quickly, hand-to-hand combat, musket volleys, bayonets flashing. It was a stunning victory. We captured nearly 1,000 prisoners and lost only a handful of men. The news spread like wildfire. I remember standing amidst the captured Hessians, realizing this wasn't just a battle, it was a message. We were still here. We were fighting. We could win. The victory at Trenton was the first glimmer of hope in a long, dark winter. But we weren't done. Just days later, on January 3rd, 1777, we launched a follow-up attack at Princeton. Another risky night march, another tough fight, and another win. These back-to-back victories were a turning point. They lifted the spirits of our troops and supporters, proving the revolution still had teeth. Odd fact: I lost a shoe during the Trenton crossing and spent part of the battle hobbling on one foot, which made me look like a pirate. Minus the eye patch, historians still debate how much these battles actually changed the course of the war versus how much they boosted morale and public perception. I say morale's half the battle. What I do know is that those icy nights showed us what we were made of. We could endure cold, mud, hunger, and impossible odds and come out fighting. So, as we moved on to the hard months ahead, I held on to that feeling, that stubborn hope. Because in the fight for independence, hope was the one thing we couldn't afford to lose. Winter had barely loosened its grip when spring arrived, bringing a new challenge. The British were regrouping and planning their next moves. New York was still under threat, Philadelphia was vulnerable, and our ragtag army was stretched thin and weary. The reality of sustaining a rebellion against the mightiest empire on earth began to settle like a heavy fog. I spent much of 1770 settling between camps, forts, and Congress halls, balancing the role of military commander with that of diplomat, fundraiser, and sometimes morale officer. You'd think a general's life was all action and glory, but I spent an awful lot of time writing letters begging for blankets and ammunition. Dear Congress, if you could please send socks. Again, and then the whispers started. Not all were convinced the revolution would last. Some wanted to cut their losses, swear allegiance, and maybe even cozy up with the king again. Loyalists in the cities thought the fight was foolish, and many colonists just wanted peace and bread. I can't blame them. The British launched a major campaign under General Howe, landing in Philadelphia in late summer. It was clear they intended to capture the seat of the new government and crush our rebellion decisively. I was left to defend the middle colonies with fewer troops and less support than I'd ever seen. The strain showed in our ranks. Men grew restless. Supplies dwindled. Diseases ran rampant. At one point, I contracted smallpox. Or maybe it was the flu. Hard to tell when you're shivering and hallucinating about redcoats in your tea. Odd fact: one of my aides reportedly tried to use a live chicken as a thermometer. The bird protested loudly, and so did I. Despite everything, we kept fighting. The summer of '77 was a grueling back-and-forth skirmishes, marches, retreats, and bitter defeats. The Battle of Brandywine was a disaster. We lost the field and Philadelphia fell. The British had won a major prize. I felt the weight of every loss. The faces of the men, the hopes of a fledgling nation, the trust of Martha all pressed on me. Historians still debate whether Howe's slow advance cost the British the war or gave us time to regroup. I leaned toward giving credit to stubborn resilience. Then, in October 1777, came a surprise that changed everything. Over in upstate New York, General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold surrounded British General Burgoyne's army at Saratoga. After weeks of fighting, Burgoyne surrendered his entire force, nearly 6,000 men. Saratoga was the revolution's turning point. It convinced foreign powers, especially France, that we might actually win. And France's entry into the war gave U.S. ships, soldiers, and a much-needed boost in legitimacy. Odd fact: French officers brought fancy wigs and ridiculously ornate uniforms. Some of our men thought they were circus performers. I was half tempted to recruit them just for the spectacle. With new allies and renewed hope, we prepared for the long haul. The war was far from over, but now we had a fighting chance. I remember sitting by the fire one night, holding a letter from Benjamin Franklin in Paris, and feeling something I hadn't in a long time: optimism. Because if a ragtag group of colonists could get the French Navy on their side, maybe, just maybe, we could win this. And that meant everything. By the spring of 1778, the war had settled into a grinding stalemate. The British held cities. We held the countryside. Battles were fought, but decisive victories were rare. Still, every day I rode with a sense that the tides were shifting. That's when I decided to move our headquarters to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a cold, muddy, windswept camp that would become synonymous with endurance and sacrifice. Setting up winter quarters, there was a gamble. The land was rugged and the winter harsh, but it was central and defensible. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the revolution. Food was scarce. Shoes wore out, leaving men to march barefoot in snow. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia ravaged our ranks. I had one of the worst quarters in the camp, with drafty huts that rattled with every gust of wind. Some nights, the cold was so severe I thought my whiskers would freeze solid. Odd fact. Soldiers would stuff straw into their hats to keep their heads warm, leading to some unfortunate hat-shaped hay bales wandering the camp. Yet amidst the hardship, something remarkable happened. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben arrived with a mission to train and discipline the Continental Army. He didn't speak much English, and we barely spoke German, but through grunts, gestures, and plenty of patience, he taught us how to fight like a real army. Von Steuben's drills were brutal, but effective. I swear, after a few weeks of his goose step, even the stiffest colonel could march without tripping over his own feet. He turned ragtag farmers into soldiers who could load and fire muskets in synchronized precision and hold ranks under pressure. Historians still debate how much von Steuben's training changed the course of the war. I'll tell you, it changed everything. Our army was reborn. During those cold months, the men's resilience became legendary. One soldier famously wrote home about using a book for a pillow and frostbite for a blanket. Another rigged a heater from an old cannon barrel smoke. And we kept watch on the British forces in Philadelphia, hoping they'd make a move, but they stayed put. Meanwhile, Congress struggled to supply us, and rumors of desertion grew. But the men who stayed were committed beyond measure. One evening, I walked the camp, watching shadows flicker over tents, hearing the soft crunch of boots on snow, and I realized something. This wasn't just an army, it was a family forged in fire and frost. That winter at Valley Forge tested us in every way possible. It stripped us down to our bones and built us back stronger. And when spring finally came, with the thaw and birdsong, we marched out ready to take the fight back, because the revolution was far from over. In fact, the hardest battles were still ahead. Spring 1779 was a strange season of fighting and maneuvering, with the war stretching from the northern forests all the way down to the southern swamps of the Carolinas. While I had been focusing on the northern theater, the southern colonies were becoming a fiery hotspot. It was a reminder that this wasn't a simple battle over a few cities. It was a sprawling, messy struggle across a continent. One of my trusted generals, Nathaniel Greene, took command in the South and led a brilliant, if exhausting, campaign of hit-and-run tactics against British forces. Greene's strategy was to stretch the enemy thin and wear them down, kind of like a cat with a particularly stubborn mouse. It was slow and frustrating, but effective. Meanwhile, I was still wrestling with supply issues and political bickering back home. Congress had a habit of promising support and then mysteriously disappearing when it was time to deliver. One time, a shipment of muskets arrived 3 months late and with half the barrels missing. Our men called them one-eyed muskets and said they were great for shooting squirrels, but not much else. Odd fact, we once received a shipment of shoes so small, men joked we'd be better off running barefoot, except that was dangerous. 2, because snakes love bare feet. As the war dragged on, British General Cornwallis began focusing on the South, capturing key towns and hoping to rally loyalists. The fighting became brutal, with skirmishes in the forests and towns that blurred the lines between soldier and civilian. Then came the pivotal moment, the Siege of Yorktown, in 1781. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. With French allies who had finally committed fully to our cause, we coordinated a siege that trapped Cornwallis on the Virginia Peninsula. French naval forces blocked the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any hope of escape or resupply. The siege lasted weeks, with constant bombardment and dwindling supplies on both sides. I remember standing on a hill overlooking the battlefield, the smoke hanging low like a bad hangover, and thinking, finally, we might actually win this thing. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his army, over 7,000 men. It was a staggering victory, one that broke the British will and made the end of the war inevitable. Odd fact: Cornwallis supposedly claimed illness and sent his second-in-command to surrender on his behalf. Talk about dodging the spotlight. Historians still debate whether Yorktown was the inevitable conclusion or a lucky strike aided by French timing and British blunders. For me, it was a moment of profound relief and deep reflection. We had won a war that had seemed impossible, with a collection of farmers, tradesmen, and idealists standing against the greatest empire in the world. I thought about the long journey, the forests and frost, the losses and victories, the sacrifices and stubbornness. And as I prepared to retire from command, I knew the hard work was just beginning, because winning a war was one thing, building a nation, that was the real challenge. After Yorktown, the fighting slowed and eventually ceased. The British government, weary and financially strained, began negotiating peace. By 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the independence of the United States of America. I laid down my command with a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. Leading an army was one thing, leading a country was another. I returned to Mount Vernon, craving the quiet life I had once known, but aware that my role in this new nation was far from over. One odd moment that sticks in my memory: shortly after returning home, I was almost kidnapped by a band of deserters who were angry over unpaid wages. I was saved only by a quick-thinking servant and a misplaced musket barrel. Guess being a former general didn't guarantee safety back then. Historians still debate how much my leadership during the war shaped the eventual American identity versus the collective effort of many voices and hands. My view: it was a messy, glorious team effort with a stubborn general lucky enough to hold the reins at the right time. But before the war, the nation was a fragile experiment. We had to create systems of governance, balance freedom with order, and build a society from the ground up. Odd fact: at one point, I refused to be crowned king when some factions suggested it, believing a republic was the better path, even if that meant more headaches. The road to a new nation was rocky, with debates over the Constitution, the role of the federal government, and the rights of citizens. I found myself serving as the first president, navigating these uncharted waters with the same determination that had carried me through frozen rivers and burned forts. As I look back on that journey on horseback, through frost and fire, I see a story not just about battles won or lost, but about resilience, vision, and the refusal to give up when the odds were stacked impossibly high. And if there's one thing I'd want you to take away tonight, it's this: history isn't just about kings and generals. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, sometimes by sheer stubbornness and hope. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the cold wind biting your face, the crunch of snow underfoot, the flicker of a campfire's glow, and the quiet courage it took to change the world. Thank you for coming along on this ride. Now, take a deep breath, feel your body relax, and listen as the night softly wraps you in its calm embrace. Slowly, let your breath become gentle and even, like the quiet flow of a calm river. Feel the weight of your body sinking deeper into your chair or bed. Imagine the soft glow of a campfire flickering in the distance, the warm amber light dancing on your skin. Picture yourself wrapped in a thick cloak, the chill of the night softened by the fire's embrace. The air smells faintly of pine and earth, crisp but comforting. With every breath, your muscles release their tension, your mind quiets. The sound of distant horses' hooves fades into a steady rhythm, lulling you further into calm. Imagine the gentle crackle of burning wood, the occasional spark drifting upward like tiny stars, disappearing into the night sky. Let the image of frost-kissed trees blur gently at the edges as your thoughts drift away like clouds. You are safe, warm, and at peace. As you feel your eyes grow heavy, know that you carry within you the strength and courage of those who came before, ready to face tomorrow's challenges with quiet confidence. Good night, friend.